my name is Professor Alma Harris from the University of Swansea, and it's my pleasure to be with you today to talk about this chapter, Connecting Distributed Leadership and Networking. What does the evidence tell us? And I'm delighted that the lead author of this chapter, Cecilia Azorín, is here to help me walk you through this chapter. So I'll ask Cecilia just to briefly introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Alma. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I am Cecilia Azorín. I work at the University of Murcia, Spain, at the Department of Didactic and School Organization.
Thanks, Cecilia. And one of our co-authors is unable to be here, Michelle Jones, also from the University of Swansea. But our intention really is to very briefly walk you through this chapter, its key ideas, and to really draw some very firm conclusions at the end. If you've read the chapter, then you'll know some of the propositions, you'll know some of the conclusions, but our aim here is to just illuminate and talk you through some of the key concepts and the key, I think, propositions that appear within this chapter. So Cecilia, over to you first.
Okay. Thank you, Alma. So I think that there are two main ideas that we want to highlight. And one is, the first is that the pandemic is a profound example of global adaptive challenge for nations across the globe. And the second is that networks are now the new leadership front line of resilience in combating COVID-19. So considering these important questions, we have here the structure of the presentation and also the structure of the chapter. And we are aware in our chapter that networks and networking between and beyond schools are an exponential and global educational force. So the coronavirus crisis is showing us that leaders at all levels have been challenging to collaborate, not only to survive, but also to ensure that the best positive outcomes for children and young people in their care. So this chapter explores networks and networking through the empirical and theoretical vantage point of distributed leadership, and the 10 evidence propositions are presented about this type of leadership practices that are most prevalent and effective within networks. And finally, we will look to the conclusions, looking to the future, and including some reflections to moving forward. And the aim of this paper, of this chapter, is to explore whether distributed leadership can illuminate the various types of leadership practices within professional learning networks. And of course, this is happening. Is something important for us because this is the aim, explore whether distributed leadership can illuminate this various type of leadership. But this is happening right now. Some has a result of COVID, but others has a part of an educational landscape that predates the virus. So this chapter looks at the type of leadership practicing and approaches that are most prevalent in the network literature. This is the selected, we are going to present the selected literature, the review in different countries. And the overview takes a particular line of inquiry by asking questions about the forms of leadership practice that are apparent in school-to-school networks. And we use several criteria. The sources selected were chosen after conducting a review of a screening process based on these pre-established criteria, including age, subject, pathways, and impact. And age means articles published in the last decade, mainly. And subject is related to content related to networking leadership. And pathways is about discussion of network leadership strategies and approaches. And impact is related to the studies that highlight evidence on impact at the school, teacher, or student level. So we have here the selected literature review from different countries in English, but also in Spanish. We have here the opportunity to know more about the Spanish literature in terms of network leadership. And there are evidence from different countries, United States, United Kingdom, Spain, Chile. Alma is now going to illustrate now us with the 10 propositions based on the selected literature analysis. So thank you.
Thanks, Cecilia. It's important, I think, just to underline that this is a selected literature. It's a contemporary literature. It's not a comprehensive literature. There'll be things that you won't find there, but we've selected them deliberately because we think they speak directly to the leadership of networks. And I think what's very important is that Cecilia is able to bring to us a new literature in the form of being able to speak Spanish when so often literatures in other language are actually hidden. So I think this is an interesting set of papers that you see here in this particular selected review. My purpose next is just to give you a flavor of, when we looked across the actual literature, give you a flavor of the main themes and the content of that literature. So we found, if you read the chapter, 10 propositions which come from looking right across that selected literature. And I'm just going to very briefly touch upon each of those and give you a sort of outline of what we think we found from this selected literature. So the first thing that I think we found was and we know this obviously from the wider evidence around middle leadership, and there's a lot of evidence in the United States, of course, you will know that, be familiar with it. And we know how critical the middle leader role is. But what we found in this literature is that the middle leadership actually supports effective network. From the position of being in the middle, they are able to structurally and professionally support networks. So the first message, I guess, is that the middle leaders in our schools are critically important in supporting and actually sustaining effective networks. The second speaks to the issue of teacher leadership and why these teachers may play a different role in terms of their position. They are still critically important when it comes to networking. Their collaborative practices, their collaborative inquiries, their professional learning communities, whatever you wish to call them, are really the energizers within the networks. And these teacher leaders are also connectors within networks. The third speaks to the importance of innovation. I mean, unless networks innovate and change things, then they're just empty networks, aren't they? So I think that this speaks to the importance of innovation and change, centered on evidence, centered on action research. And here for the first time, we touch upon the importance of distributed leadership, where leadership is shared right across the networks. So innovation and change at the heart of effective networks, otherwise they are empty, they are futile. It's not just a joining of colleagues, it's actually a mobilization of energy and change. The fourth point is about collaborative practices. And I guess the notion that these practices are very much focused on teaching and learning within the school context. And that can't be more important because we know about the importance of instructional leadership, pretty big evidence base on that. So here collaborative practices are integrated and focused upon practice, issues of practice that are real and important to schools. The fifth point is about formal leadership, and this is somewhat an irony, and I've written about this, but without the formal leadership supporting and I guess engaging with distributed leadership never happens. So there's an integrated relationship between distributed leadership and the formal leadership, so that it actually does happen in practice. The formal leaders can be gatekeepers to distributed leadership. So without their support, without their enthusiasm, without their relinquishing of certain responsibilities, then distributed leadership will never happen. The sixth point, Ken Leithwood has written, you probably know Ken Leithwood's name, has written quite a lot about this and the importance of the patterns of distributed leadership. Distributed leadership isn't a panacea. It's not necessarily a good thing, as my good friend Jim Spillane would say, or Spillane would say, in Chicago. It much depends on the way it is distributed, and much depends on the patterns of distribution. And that's exactly the case when it comes to networking. The patterns of distribution within that network fundamentally matter to the way that network operates and its outcomes. We see a direct link as well with the literature on communities of practice, Wenger's notion of communities of practice, and the idea of a network that is based on distributed leadership practices. So we're seeing some connections here between that literature and the more contemporary literature on networks, and that's something I think worth exploring. Support, we found that distributed leadership doesn't happen and isn't effective unless there are clear levels of support. And this speaks to the formal support, but also the support within the school, the cultural support that is required for teachers and middle leaders and others within the school to work together culturally in collaborative practice. Finally, I guess leadership is not fixed, but it's interchangeable. So there is no blueprint for distributed leadership within networks. And if there was, I wouldn't advocate it, because it depends on the context of the school, the people that you have. So the idea that that model is very interchangeable, it is fluid, it is not fixed. And finally, Andy Hargreaves' notion of professional capital. Well, here we have professional capacity, because without the capacity within the system, within the school, then collaboration and networking is just something in name. It's not something in practice. So the last point is about the importance of capacity building within networks, within schools, within regions, within districts, to ensure that this networking is the most productive that it can be. So I think if we turn to our what's next slide, and I want to say that I'm very pleased that Deborah Netolicky, the editor of this particular volume, the insights to put together so many interesting chapters. So an acknowledgement to her. But in our chapter, we come to, I guess, tentative conclusion. I mean, the idea of what's next in COVID times is a bit unpredictable. But we think that distributed leadership as a theoretical model has now found a practical implementation through networking in the most contemporary sense of networking. And it's an alternative and a powerful theoretical frame on networks and networking. And many other scholars, I'm sure, will take the distributed leadership theory, superimpose it on networks and reach some conclusions. But in a way, our conclusion is that it provides a new lens on maybe an old issue around networking. The other thing is that distributed leadership is a critical component in effective networking. All the papers that we looked at, all the evidence would suggest that it's very hard to network unless you've got some form of distributed leadership. I mean, networks by definition are distributed leadership in action. But I think we need to get under that a little bit more and be more sophisticated about the analysis we do on distributed leadership and the patterns of distribution that we've said vary so widely. The importance of many actors playing crucial roles. We've talked about teacher leadership, we've talked about middle leadership, we've talked about formal leadership. Distributed leadership is not the purview of one group, it belongs to the organization. And organizational change theory would speak to that. And very finally, I think, the future leadership is already here. I think the networking we've seen as a result of COVID, the innovation and change we've seen as a result of COVID, has put us on a different level when it comes to thinking about networking and networks. We've moved on substantially, I think, from the previous ideas of networks, which are rather clunky and formalized and probably not that productive unless there was some energy, both external and internal, driving that forward. And we have many international examples, of course, of effective networks that have stood the test of time and have proven again and again that when you bring teachers together to work on real problems of practice from different schools and different jurisdictions, the outcomes can be quite remarkable. So I think that's where we end our presentation for you today. Thank you. I hope you find the chapter illuminating and useful, and I'm no doubt it'll bring more questions than answers. But my final word is to underline that isolation is the enemy of improvement. And as we go forward in our education systems, whether in the USA, Spain, Wales, England, we need our networks of practitioners and schools more than ever. Thank you very much.